let's think about stress from not whether or not it's acute or chronic, whether or not it's good for us or bad for us, but on 3 different time scales, because then we can arrive at what this is all about as it relates to emotions. Because trust me, this has everything to do with emotions and whether or not you're functioning well emotionally or you're not functioning well emotionally, whether or not you're coping or not coping. So those are typically psychological terms and psychological discussions. We are entering this through the portal of physiology, the stuff of medical textbooks, and we will arrive at the psychology soon. But I really want you to understand the difference between the 3 kinds of stress on 3 different time scales: short term, medium term, and long term, and what it's good for and what it's bad for. I think we've all heard that stress is bad for us. We've seen these pictures intended to frighten us, and indeed they are frightening. You see the nice, really plump brain on the left. It says healthy or control, and then you see the brain that says stressed above it on the right, and it's like withered. Or we see that the hippocampus, an area involved in memory, is smaller. People that are stressed. We see that the Alzheimer's brain is made worse by stress, that people who have a predisposition of schizophrenia, when they get stressed, higher incidence of schizophrenic episodes. You hear that addicts will relapse when they're stressed. I mean, okay, we get it. And it's very important. But I think we've all heard now so many times that stress is bad. But in that conversation, unfortunately, it's eclipsed some of the really positive things that stress does for us in the short term. So stress can be short-term, medium-term, or long-term. Long-term stress is indeed bad for all the reasons I just mentioned and many others. But what's never actually been discussed is what stress is so terrific for, positive for in the short term. And I think we tend to overlook the important question, which is what is short-term and what is long-term? No one ever bothers to tell us what is chronic, what is acute. Right? Is it 5 minutes? Is it 5 days? Is it for the duration of final exams? Or is it for the duration of a senior thesis in college? No one actually draws boundaries around this stuff or even general guidelines. And so it's become a bit of a mess, frankly, to try and decipher this whole space around stress. So I'm going to try and clean some of this up for you based on what we know from the scientific data. Short-term stress, great. The key is to be able to turn the stress response off when you're done, when you don't want that. In fact, let's just really tamp down the relationship between the short-term or acute stress response and infection. Many of us are familiar with the experience of work, or taking care of a loved one, or stress, and then we finally relax. Maybe we even go on vacation. Like, oh, now I'm finally going to get the break. And then we get sick. And that's because the adrenaline response crashed and your immune system crashed with it. So please understand this. Now, many of you might say, well, how long? Is it 2 hours? Is it 3 hours? A lot of you out there that really like specificity. It will vary for everybody. I would just kind of use a rule of thumb. When you are no longer able to achieve good sleep, what good sleep means to you, and please see the episodes on sleep if you want more about tools to sleep. When you are no longer able to achieve good sleep, you are now moving from acute stress to chronic stress. You need to be able to turn the stress response off. If I have one wish, well, I have many wishes for this lifetime, but if I have one wish today that I hope will permeate and spread out there, is this idea that we need from a young age, but even as adults and forever, we need to learn how to turn off our stress response. Physiological sigh is one. If we're going to activate our stress response intentionally by ice baths, cold showers, cyclic hyperoxygenated breathing, aka Tumo breathing or Wim Hof breathing, we also need to learn how to press the brake. Okay, so let's think about the stress system. It knows how to activate itself. Now we're talking about a way of deliberately activating your stress system in order to combat infection. I do this from time to time. I might feel a tickle in my throat or like I'm getting kind of run down. I will do this kind of breathing. I do. I will take 25 or 30 breaths, exhale, hold my breath. 25, 30 breaths again, exhale, hold my breath for about 15 seconds. 25, 30 breaths again, exhale, hold my breath for 25 or 30 seconds, then a big inhale, and I hold my breath until I feel the impulse to breathe. Again, I feel it's safe for me. I've run it by my doctor, so it's fine. You should not do this unless it's right for you, but I do this. Some people like the ice bath. I rarely do the ice bath. Some people like cold showers. I like hot showers. So I take hot showers, but I do this kind of breathing. Again, they are all having more or less the same effect of increasing adrenaline, and which allows you to combat the infection because you're activating the immune response. Okay, so now let's talk about medium-term stress. Medium-term stress is going to be stress that lasts anywhere from several days to several weeks. Okay, we might think of that as long-term stress. There are times in life when we are just dealing with a lot. Okay, this particular quarter, I happen to be directing a course. I'm doing the lab. I'm doing this. I enjoy all these things immensely, but I'm kind of near my threshold. I'm near the point where any additional thing, like I couldn't log on to a website the other day, and it felt like the most intense thing in the world at that moment, and I kind of laughed at myself. Fortunately, I caught it, but that typically wouldn't be my response under conditions where I wasn't pushed to threshold. What is this medium-term stress? What is stress threshold? Well, stress threshold is actually our ability to cognitively regulate what's going on in our body. So we've all hear so much about we need to unify our mind and body. We need to be at one with our mind and body. Or now I realize I'm kind of poking fun at some of the new agey language, but the reason I poke fun is not because I don't think it has value, but it has no specificity. What does that mean? I mean, I think I'm always in my body. I've never fortunately looked across the room and seen my arm over there or my leg over there. I'm connected to my body. There actually is a syndrome where people feel disconnected from their limbs. This is a real clinical condition. These people actually will seek out amputation. They will try and convince doctors to amputate certain portions of their body. It's a really terrible thing for people to have. And it relates to a change in central maps in the brain, believe it or not. Most of us want to keep our limbs, whichever ones we happen to have. And most of us feel one in mind and body, so much so that when stress hits, we feel it in our mind and body. A lot of stress inoculation, a lot of managing medium-term stress on the time scale of weeks or maybe even a couple months. So we're not talking about years of stress. A lot of that has to do with raising our stress threshold. It's about capacity. And there are very simple tools, excellent tools that will allow us to modulate our capacity for stress. And they look a lot like the tools I just described. They involve placing oneself deliberately into a situation where our adrenaline is increased somewhat, not to the extreme. And then when we feel flooded with adrenaline, and normally we would panic, it's about cognitively, mentally, emotionally calming ourselves and being comfortable with that response in our body. So unlike trying to unify the mind and body and make it all calm or make it all alert, this is about dissociating mind and body in a healthy way. And what would this look like? Well, this is something I actually do as a practice because I mentioned before, you can use physiological size in real time. You can use the cyclic hyperoxygenation breathing to combat infection if you're feeling kind of run down. And there's also a way in which you can use things like cold showers, or if you exercise and you bring your heart rate up very high, you kind of go into that high intensity realm where your heart is beating a little bit harder than you're comfortable with. And that you feel, some people think it's lactic acid. No one can agree on this, what the burn is, whether it's lactic acid or it's buildup of hydrogen or whatever. I don't want to get into that, but we're all familiar with the intense feeling of your muscles kind of burning because you're working very hard physically. The key in those moments is to learn to relax the mind while the body is very activated. And what that tends to do, there's a limited amount of research on this, but what that tends to do is it tends to create a situation where what once felt like a lot feels manageable. Okay, you've raised your stress threshold or your stress capacity. One way that you can do this, and this is kind of fun, if it's approved by your physician and you're able to do this, you can bring your heart rate up. You could do this through an ice bath if that's your thing, or a cold shower, or cyclic oxygenation breathing, or you could sprint, or you could go hard on the bike. Whatever it is that brings your heart rate up. And then what you want to do is you want to actually try and calm the mind while your body is in this heightened state of activation. And the best way that I'm aware to do that, again, goes back to physiology, not psychology. When we are stressed, our pupils dilate. The effect of that pupil dilation is to create tunnel vision. It literally narrows our view of the visual world. We no longer see in panorama. And there's some other effects as well, but that's because the visual system through this cranial nerve system that I described before is tethered and is part of this autonomic nervous system. By deliberately dilating your gaze, meaning not moving your head and eyes around, but by deliberately going from tunnel vision to broader panoramic vision, literally seeing more of your environment all at once. You don't have to do what I'm doing, which is not blinking. You're welcome to blink. But it means deliberately dilating your gaze so that you can see yourself in the environment you're in. It creates a calming effect on the mind because it releases a particular circuit in the brainstem that's associated with alertness, aka stress. Now, this is very powerful. If you're running, for instance, and you're at max capacity or close to it, or you're kind of hitting like 80, 90% of maximum on the bike, and you dilate your gaze, what you'll find is the mind can relax while the body is in full output. And this is relates to work that in various communities, people are working with this in the sports community, military communities, et cetera. But it's a form not really of stress inoculation. It's more about raising stress threshold so that the body is going to continue to be in a high alertness, high reactivity mode, high output, but the mind is calm. And so this isn't about unifying mind and body. This is actually about using body to bring up your level of activation, then dissociating, not the clinical dissociation kind of disorders, but dissociating the mental or emotional response from what's going on in your body. And over time, so if you do this, a couple times, you don't have to do this every workout, but if you do this maybe once a week or so, you start being comfortable at these higher activation states. What once felt overwhelming and like a lot of work now is manageable. It feels tolerable.